allow me the honor to introduce today's speakers. We have Jacob joining us from Vancouver, Canada. Jacob is a director of product and engineering at takingroot.org. He received his bachelor's degree in sociology at Harvard and a PhD from Stanford. We also have Asia joining us from Houston today. She is the assistant professor at UT Health Houston, got her bachelor's degree of psychology from Rice University, MA and PhD from University of Vermont. We also have Michael joining us from Chicago, who is the assistant professor at University of Chicago, BA, MA, and a PhD in economics, all from Stanford. And I'm a co-founder at Kyros. I'll be your host today. So with that, I will pass on to Jacob to get started. Jacob, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rebecca. Excited to have you all here. So we thought we'd start really at the beginning about what are the social sciences. I know before I studied in university, I had no idea really what they were at all. I went to a small public high school. We didn't have a lot of choices of what classes to take. And other than social studies, which was basically history, we really didn't have much in terms of psychology, political science, economics. There were a few things here and there, but it was nothing formal for sure. And I thought it'd be helpful to set the table in terms of what really drives social scientists, right? And it is this fascination with human behavior, organizational behavior, and also thinking about institutions, so social and cultural norms as well. And really, it's the study of that unites social sciences. If you go to the next slide. And when we say the study, what do we mean? I like to kind of break this into two different elements. So the focus is on asking questions about human behavior, organizational behavior, institutions. And when we analyze it, what do we mean? We mean that we're collecting data and actually doing some additional analysis to understand that data better. And I like to think about this along two dimensions for each. So in terms of collecting data, there's two primary types of data, though there's a lot of gray area in between for sure. One is observational data. So you do that by actually observing the world. So what is the data that we all produce in our daily lives? So things like voting that just sort of happen whenever there's an election, like there is in November in the States at least, or in Canada on October 15th. The stock market, people are making investments, stocks move, that's data that's available. If you're on Twitter or follow news there or what have you, that data is also something that is recorded and could be studied, and a lot of folks do that too. On the other end is experimental data. So this is data that you actually go out and you design and collect yourself. So this is outside of what would be collected through your normal day-to-day interactions, and you go into a lab setting or some sort of artificial setting, typically, and then try to understand something in that environment. And the advantage of an experimental approach is you can use that artificial environment to try to control a lot of things that you just cannot do in sort of the real world, like you can't change the date that folks vote on. That would not be really ethical or possible, right? So you might look to experimental methods to try to study questions there. So those are the two dimensions in terms of collecting data. Analyzing data, also there's a lot of difference between social science disciplines and how they do that. So for example, there are two main types of data analysis. There's others, but these are the two really ends of this spectrum. One is qualitative. So often this is identifying patterns in unstructured data. So this is very common in anthropology, where folks will go and try to observe and take notes, that sort of thing. They might look at what's being produced in popular presses. So through newspaper articles, books, that sort of thing. They might interview people to understand what's going on. So video as well is another common source. And that's really trying to take this unstructured data, identify patterns, and provide some structure to it. On the other side, and maybe you're more familiar with this if you've taken economics or statistics class, is typically a more quantitative analysis. And this is really data that can be represented easily by numbers. So something like voting behavior. Did you vote? Did you not vote? Right? If we take stock prices again, that's something where there's a number associated with the stock price. Survey responses can kind of be either, but often there's a scale. Maybe you've seen a 1 to 5 scale, or if someone gives you a question that says, how likely would you be to recommend a product, right? On a scale, that would be a numerical response. I think this is very much like an ideal representation. As I mentioned, there's a lot of gray areas. So some social scientists don't analyze data at all. Michael might be able to speak to this a little better later on, but in economics, there's a lot of people who build mathematical models and simulations, sociology as well. And I would also say that there's a lot of innovation in the social sciences around mixing these different techniques. So people taking a quantitative approach to sort of like a case study or what have you, that is typically more of a qualitative sort of thing. And people doing experiments in the real world, like field experiments, which you're kind of mixing some of this observational and experimental methodologies. So that's where a lot of the innovation in terms of research tends to happen in this kind of blurry area. Next slide. So the other takeaway I would have from this presentation is just because someone says that you're an economist or political scientist or sociologist, what have you, it doesn't actually really help you locate you on these two critical dimensions of how you actually do data analysis and collect data. So I tried to color code in this slide. Just using economics as an example, you have microeconomics, which oftentimes is using large data sets, a very quantitative approach to observing the real world. On the other side, you have folks who are behavioral economists who are actually operating in labs in very artificial environments purposely and taking an experimental approach to actually collecting data. So just because someone says that they're studying something, it doesn't really help identify exactly what they do in their day-to-day. Similarly, sociology, you could have people who all they do is interview people and observe through participant observation, or they could be similar to economists and analyzing large microeconomists and analyzing large data sets. So that's something where there's just a tremendous diversity even within the various disciplines that I think sometimes gets overlooked. Next slide. And so this is very high level, but at least from my perspective, the hardest thing in the social sciences is asking the right questions, right? There's a lot of smart people out there who've studied these sorts of things for a long time. It's not always obvious what's a question that people care about that hasn't actually been answered by prior research or answered in a really creative way. The other thing I would say is once you actually have an interesting question that is of interest typically to academic community as well as, hopefully would have impact on the world as well, is you have to execute on it. And this varies a lot from discipline to discipline. But I remember a professor of mine, when I had a research idea, said, you need to love this enough to work on it for 5 years of your life, because that's sort of the process for publication between data collection, analysis, and that sort of thing. And once again, there's a lot of variance from discipline to discipline and how long it takes to publish. But I feel like that 5-year number is a good rough estimate for a lot of social science. The other thing is it's increasingly a team sport. This is true of hard sciences as well, but as there's more knowledge out there and more sophisticated tools for data collection and for analysis, you see fewer papers where there's a single person who's behind those papers. Typically, you will go together with other folks who are specialists at various part of the research process. And so you have to have that sort of collaboration there. And related to that collaboration is you have to be able to communicate really well. And I think this gets overlooked, where oftentimes in the media, you think about this sort of nerdy professor who maybe is kind of socially awkward. That is not my experience, at least in the social sciences. A lot of times, the folks who really have the greatest impact are just really good communicators of why what they're studying and what their approach is important and what that impact is. Next slide. So the other thing I would say is it may seem obvious if you read a paper in one of your classes or what have you, that, man, this seems very easy. And as I mentioned with the 5 years sort of thing, it's tough. And so this is a very classic comic that's passed around grad schools all over the place from XKCD, where, it seems really straightforward that, hey, this person used to think that correlation implied causation. So they used to think if they saw a pattern, it meant, this, in this case, this statistics class had an impact and it improved the student's knowledge. And sort of the joke at the end is that, well, maybe it did, maybe it didn't. And that's in part because it's sometimes really challenging to design really research that can measure impact exactly in the social sciences, in part because there may be ethical issues, there may be data collection issues. It's just different than something like a chemistry or physics lab where you can really recreate those conditions again and again and get tons and tons of data to see if what you're seeing is there. Sometimes in the real world, you only get to run something once, or there's just not a lot of data. So going back to the presidential elections, there's not that many presidential elections in history, and you can't just say, why don't we do this again and again and again, because that's just not something that can happen. Or similarly, a lot of people are studying things around gender roles or marriage or those sorts of issues, and you can't just say, hey, can we randomly assign some people to get married and see what happens? So that's both, I think, a challenge in terms of doing research, but also it's really rewarding because a lot of those questions matter a ton. Next slide. So this is also very simplistic, but I think it's helpful to think about what can you actually do with a social science degree. And the story I'll tell you is when I told my family that I was going to major in sociology, they thought I was going to be a social worker. And as you will see, a lot of folks who are on this panel, they've had a really diverse set of careers. And it's not just if you major in economics, you're an economist. If you major in psychology, you're a psychologist, right? It's not that simple. And the three broad paths, I would say, there is the academic path, which is kind of more straightforward there. And we have Michael on the panel, who is a professor. And some of the really awesome things about being a professor, which Michael will say, is, you have the freedom to sort of study what you think is important, and working with students is super rewarding. Those are the most common things for my friends who are university professors. They just love working with students, and they can study what they think is interesting. I think the cons, the things that maybe don't get talked about as much, it's very long hours. And compensation, though it varies by field, is typically lower than what you could get in the private sector. We then are lucky to have Asia on this panel, who's more of this applied academic, which is something I don't think gets talked about a lot. So Asia is a director of diversity and inclusion, but this category would include think tanks like the Brookings Institute, government jobs where you're doing a lot of this sort of applied research. And I think some of the pros there, you may also have these kind of hybrid faculty positions where you do still get to teach. Um, but yeah, but it's not your primary sort of thing of teaching and research. And then Asia can talk through some of the other pros as well. Compensation, once again, is a little bit more skewed towards the academic side, and it tends to be a little bit lower, but with a high level of work-life balance. And on the professional side, an example, this is not my position right now, but people analytics is a very common area to go into from sociology, which is why I picked it. And one of the pros there is private sector tends to have higher compensation. And then also the stuff you do tends to get implemented a lot faster. The way that you have impact in research often is through your students and through teaching, as well as through publications that then get picked up and turned into policy or behavior changes. But that's a slower kind of process for that to happen versus if you have a finding like a friend of mine who worked in people analytics, then a company can implement that typically a lot faster. The cons are you typically have to do research that's really targeted towards towards profitability, reducing costs. There's just a much narrower scope of what you can study than if you're an applied academic or an academic. Next slide. So the three of us are going to go through our career paths just really quickly, as well as some elements of what it takes to succeed, at least in our undergrad. So I'll start since I already am driving this. So this on the slide kind of outlines general career path, which for me was very nonlinear. So I did get a bachelor's in sociology from Harvard. I then went into this consulting role at the Bridgespan Group, which was more of a strategy consulting role. I kind of went back into academia before actually going to grad school and was a research associate for a year at Harvard Business School, which is a really great way to dip your toes in understanding really the ins and outs of what research takes. And then I got my PhD. I decided to sort of go fully in organizational behavior. For me, academia was not such a great fit, particularly in terms of kind of the speed of impact. So I ended up doing much more applied work at a nonprofit called Community Connect Labs, where I still was using a lot of the same tools I learned in my PhD, but was doing it in a more applied way. And continuing down that path at Taking Root, where our product is very, very data intensive. So I'm using my PhD all the time, but it's definitely, a different experience than my friends that are professors. And with that, I'll turn it over. Oh, that's right. Excuse me. And then in terms of going back to my experience at Harvard, if I was to highlight the major skills, writing is a really big thing to succeed there. And I think at a lot of universities, at least in high school, I was used to writing, a 2-page paper, a 5-page paper, maybe a 10-page paper, but you just write so much more in undergrad. Another thing, as a social science student, I really thought doing research was the best way to learn about research. And so I was lucky enough to actually be a research assistant for several professors there. And that hands-on experience was really instrumental in learning about how to do high quality research and what it really took. Statistics and math, I really wish I had done more statistics and more coding, which we'll get to later. But for me, I take a more quantitative approach to things, and I use statistics in my thesis, and it's something that I continue to use through this day. I'm not the best statistician in the world, but and most people aren't, to be honest, but it's something where it's just so useful as a lens and of how to see the world and how to understand impact, as well as for communication with others, in my opinion. Data analysis. So you could be the best statistician in the world. You could know all these fancy analysis techniques and what have you. But ultimately, you also have to be able to visualize and interpret results. I cannot tell you how many academic presentations I've even seen where everyone just talks about the graph that they produce and not necessarily all of the fancy statistics, that you can actually see what the person was trying to do in one or two graphs that just really communicate that. And that's a really different skill. And finally, coding, which is unfortunately the way that you do analysis. You'll typically need data formatted in a certain way. So let's go back to the Twitter example. So a lot of people analyze Twitter for different social trends and other things. Twitter doesn't just give you all their data in a format where it's just ready for analysis. So you need to use a lot of computer science skills, some data science skills in order to get it in a form where you can actually make it useful for both visualization, for analysis, and for interpreting it. And now with that, I'll turn it over to Asia.
Excellent. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I'm getting head nods, and so I'm going to continue. Again, my name is Asia. I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the University of Texas Health Science Center here in Houston, the largest medical center in the world. And I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised. However, I came down to Rice University where I started my undergraduate career. And during that time is where I took a deeper dive into psychology. And so I went to a public high school, but I was a part of the International Baccalaureate program. Shout out to everyone a part of IB. And that was my intro into psychology, specifically social psychology. And so when I got to Rice, I pursued that a little bit further in understanding what is psychology, what kind of job can I get, what are the questions that they ask. And what was important about this time was to really get involved in a lab. And one of those labs is the Columbia Business School. I spent 2 summers as a summer research assistant at Columbia Business School. And that enabled to give me the experiences to figure out, what does a psychologist do? From asking the question, the hypothesis, procedures. But also during this time, I got to figure out what kind of psychologist I want to be. I think when people think of psychology, they think of clinical psychology, where you talk to people and listen to their problems. But I'm a social psychologist where I study discrimination and coping strategies and things of that nature. And during my summer at Columbia Business School is where I really honed in on certain skills, such as like asking questions, survey questions, but also different methods of gaining research, such as like biomeasures, taking in cortisol, which is a measure of stress, things of that nature. So it's important that you do things over your summertime. From there, I did a smooth transition straight from undergrad into my PhD program at the University of Vermont and further studied social psychology. Now, I call myself a discrimination/stigma researcher. During undergrad, I focused more on pregnant women and race. But when I got to graduate school, I started looking at weight stigma in the workplace. And from there, because I had those experiences as a whole, I made another transition into my prior position as a director of diversity and equity for a medical school. Now, this is an applied academic position because I didn't become a professor. I'm not there at psychology, you're teaching your psychology 101 classes, things of that nature, because during my PhD program, I got a taste of that and realized it's not a good fit for me. But I know data, I know how to ask questions, and I know theory. And I like to apply that to get real world answers and solutions. And so that led me into medical school, where I teach sometimes, but that's not the focus of my position. The focus of my position is using theory to ensure that the job moves smoother, faster, and more effectively. And so I did more of a lateral move to UT Health Houston, where I'm the director of diversity and inclusion, but I'm also an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences. Again, the perks of teaching, maybe doing a little bit of research, but predominantly my job is focused on being effective using theory and data from the research to help with the functions of the business of medical school. And so what does it take to succeed as a social science student at Rice? The first thing is innovation, and that is why I love Rice University. This is not a copy, paste, or repeat situation. They're looking for your thoughts, your unique perspective. And so asking questions based on your life experiences of what you have been through was always welcomed. Understanding where the literature was and where you wanted to take it. Next is research. You did not have to be involved with research prior to Rice to get into research while at Rice. That includes during the summertime, student fellowships, all of those things. It helped you gain a unique skill set and understood what research is from beginning to end. Next is data analysis, which is what Jacob touched on. It is so important. One of the biggest skills that you'll have in your toolbox as any social science major is data analysis. And so during my time at Rice, we learned certain programs such as SPSS, data, and touched upon Python. And so I strongly suggest you get very, very familiar with data analysis. Writing was touched on by Jacob as well. Scientific writing is very different from writing for like an English class or things of that nature. So truly honing in on those skills for scientific writing is very difficult at first, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes second nature. And so please show yourself grace while you embark on that journey. And then last but not least is engagement. They want you to attend national conference, local conferences, regional conferences to present your work. At these conferences, you networked. At these conferences, you also listened to leaders in the field to understand where the field is going and how you fit into that equation. And so engagement is super important. Even though you may be young, put yourself out there to begin your network and get your name and your research out there. Okay, I'm going to pass the mic over.
Great. Thanks so much, Jacob and Asia. I'm very excited to be here to talk to all of you. So I'll start with my background. I came from the Washington, D.C. area, and I went out to Stanford University for my undergraduate. My original interests were in math and philosophy, and then I took a social science class, specifically economics, and that quickly changed my path. And so I started working towards an economics degree with math on the side, which we can talk about in a minute. During the summers, in between, I think, sophomore and junior year, I was all lined up to do a policy internship in Washington, D.C. So going home back to where I was from, and also I think I had a strong interest in policy. So I was planning to work in the government, and for idiosyncratic reasons that fell through, and I needed something quickly to occupy my time over the summer. And so somewhat serendipitously, I shifted towards doing research, mostly because it was what was available to me. But quickly, I fell in love with it. So I started doing research actually in history, although the economic history of Brazil. And then the following summer, I supplemented that as a summer research assistant in economics. And so then by the end of my undergraduate experience, I had a pretty strong sense I wanted to do more and go to graduate school in economics. But I took a 2-year interlude, mostly for, I thought it would be helpful if I entered graduate school at a more kind of developed and mature state. And so I worked at Cornerstone Research for 2 years as an analyst. This is a consulting agency, but it's something called litigation consulting, which is a bit more on the economic side. So my role there was really like a research assistant, albeit not for academic research. I then returned to Stanford University for my master's and PhD in economics. And then 6 years later, I started at the University of Chicago as an assistant professor in economics. So I thought I'd comment on, similar to what Jacob and Asia were talking about, the types of experiences I had, as well as the ones I've seen among students at Stanford and Chicago. And I'll gear my comments a little bit more towards the quantitative social sciences and especially economics. And so just like Jacob and Asia, I did research assistantships, as we talked about before. I think there's often a temptation to try to cram everything in during the year, the academic year, which can work. I personally found that summers were a really good time to get involved because you can make a much bigger investment and also a bigger impression on the research. On the quantitative side, even though social sciences is perhaps thought of as less quantitative than, say, some STEM fields, math and statistics, as Jacob and Asia both talked about as well, can be really important. In fact, for economics, graduate admissions looks more at math than it does economic coursework. And so the very first class we check in admissions is real analysis that someone would take during undergraduate. And so there are the variety of reasons for that. It's not that only math matters in the study of economics, but showing your quantitative bona fides is quite important for future graduate admissions if you want to go that path. On the social science side, of course, understanding what's important in the world via current events is really important, not just out of interest and for developing your own kind of position in the world, but it can be really important for asking the right questions. As we talked about before, that's often the hardest part, and really understanding what matters in the world is the starting point there. Coding, like we talked about before, is really essential, as is writing. And so even on the quantitative social science side, where the beginning of undergraduate study typically is in the form of problem sets where you solve models with a decent amount of math or statistics, over time, it starts to circle back more towards writing about work you're producing. And in that point, being a very good writer is essential and often reflects how clearly you're thinking about things.